I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, September 19th. And tonight, the world bid a final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth II and her 70-year reign. The late Queen's state funeral drew presidents and kings, princes and prime ministers. Crowds massed along the streets of London on Monday to honor a monarch whose 70-year reign defined an age. Around 2,000 people, ranging from world leaders to healthcare workers, gathered to mourn her. This included the Prime Minister and Governor General. After the funeral, the coffin passed through central London, and it was placed in a hearse to go to Windsor Castle. This is where the Queen will be interred alongside her husband, Prince Philip. Well, joining us now to unpack the funeral is Dr. Michael Jackson, president of the Institute for the Study of the Crown in Canada. Dr. Jackson, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's good to be back. Thank you.
Now, for our viewers who were not able to watch the funeral, can you walk us through the main events that unfolded?
Well, it all started really at St. Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh, where the Queen's coffin lay in state. And then there was a service there. Then the coffin came to London, to Buckingham Palace, and from there to the Parliament buildings, to Westminster Hall, the most ancient part of the Parliament buildings, where it lay in state for several days. And that allowed tens of thousands of people to pass by and pay their respects. It was a huge crowd, amazing, the number of people that camped out for hours and hours, for almost for a day, to get by and to go and see and pay their respects to that coffin. And then today it went to Westminster Abbey near the Parliament buildings for the funeral service. And then after the funeral service, the coffin went to Windsor Castle, to the ancient St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where there was a committal service. That is the actual funeral, the part of the funeral service where the body is committed to the Lord. And then after that, there'd be a private interment where the coffin is placed next to that of the Queen's late husband, Prince Philip.
All right, Dr. Jackson, it really is amazing how many people the Queen has touched. And we saw those lines outside waiting overnight to see the Queen's coffin. So how is the United Kingdom reacting on this day? What is the overall sentiment among people in the UK tonight?
Well, the impression I get is one of great grief, great sorrow, great respect and love for the Queen. She's a remarkable woman. She's touched a century. In her 70-year reign, she's touched so many people with her constancy, her devotion to duty, her love and affection, and her support for our liberties and freedoms.
And what is the significance of this funeral to Canada and Canadians in particular, Dr. Jackson?
Well, Queen Elizabeth has been our Queen. The only Queen most of us have known. I happen to know because I'm old enough to have known King George VI, but she is the Queen that most of Canadians have known, and she's marked an era. She's been with us all the way. She's been with us at our major events in our nation's history, the Centennial of Confederation, for example, the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959, the patriation of the Constitution in 1982, and her last visit in 2010 was the centennial of the Royal Canadian Navy. So Queen Elizabeth has been with us by our side for all the major events in our nation's history for 70 years.
All right, Dr. Jackson, just over a minute left here, but every moment leading up to and during today's funeral was meticulously planned and had a symbolic meaning, down to the items on the Queen's coffin. So what stood out to you the most in today's ceremony?
Well, I think it was the grandeur of the ceremony, the wealth, the richness of the church service and the music we heard, and the respect paid by the people. And I especially liked the National Memorial Service in Ottawa, which happened today, the remarks by former Governor General Adrian Clarkson and former Premier Brian Mulroney about their personal reflections on their meetings with the Queen and what she meant to them. That was quite an eloquent moment for both of them.
All right, Dr. Jackson, just about 30 seconds left here. But what is the legacy that Queen Elizabeth's life and reign leaves for Canada, in your opinion?
She's left Canada a stronger democracy. She adapted to the circumstances of the modern era, and Canada has come out all the better for her lengthy reign.
All right, Dr. Jackson, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily, and we look forward to having you again to talk about the new king.
I look forward to that.
Thank you, sir. Coming up next, a look at rising food costs. Statistics Canada reported the cost of groceries was up 10.8% in August compared to the previous year, which is the fastest clip that the agency has recorded since 1981. Up next, we have our interview with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. He's going to unpack the impact of inflation on household food bills as higher prices start hitting every aisle of the grocery store. Stay with us. Overall, inflation appears to be moderating in Canada, but the cost of food continues to rise at a breakneck pace. Statistics Canada reports that the cost of groceries was up 10.8% in August compared to the previous year. Now, that's the fastest clip the agency has recorded since 1981. Higher prices are hitting nearly every aisle of the grocery store, even items such as frozen vegetables that were once considered cheap substitutes for pricier products. Well, with us now to discuss the issue of rising food prices is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you for inviting me back.
Now, it's clear that the cost of groceries has been rising consistently over the year, Dr. Charlebois. Is there an end in sight for our viewers?
Not right now, unfortunately. We do believe that the food inflation rate has peaked, even though it's still creeping up a little bit. We do believe that at some point, pressure points will secede. We are likely to see the rate starting to drop by the end of this year. The general inflation rate is actually dropping, so less pressure on everything else. The food inflation rate has exceeded the general inflation rate for well over a year now. And so that's quite problematic. And that's why a lot of people are noticing higher prices at the store.
And usually when we have these conversations about rising prices at the grocery store, we're talking about a specific segment of the grocery store, the dairy aisle, the bread aisle. But now we're seeing price hikes in nearly every grocery aisle, Dr. Charlebois. Why are so many products being impacted here?
Well, it's because there are three things affecting everything. Climate change. We've had a dry summer in Europe and Asia. Here in Canada, not so bad. But if climate impacts some regions of the world, we eventually get impacted eventually. So 1, 2, Ukraine, commodity prices are still higher than the 5-year average. So that's impacting the cost of processing. And finally, we also have logistics. That's due to the pandemic. Essentially, things are still not running smoothly around the world. There are still COVID protocols in different parts of the world, especially in Asia, really slowing things down, which makes things more costly, unfortunately.
Now, are there any products that maybe aren't being impacted by these price hikes, Doctor?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can look at some places where food inflation is not that much of an issue right now. Meat products, surprisingly, things appear to be more under control compared to last year. But everything else, bakery was the big surprise this month, to be honest. We weren't expecting an increase of 15 to 16% in bakery. But in dairy, as you mentioned earlier, butter is up 16% as well. So that's becoming an issue for a growing number. In a grand scheme of things, I mean, Canada has the third lowest food inflation rate in the G7. Only Japan and France have a lower food inflation rate. So in a grand scheme of things, Canada is not doing too badly, but that doesn't help Canadian families to cope with this situation of high food prices.
Some mildly comforting news there. Now, meanwhile, there's also the issue of shrinkflation, Dr. Charlebois. Products shrinking in size and quantity, but staying the same price. So just how apparent is this in Canadian grocery stores?
It's becoming more apparent because of social media. people are sharing evidence in real time. And so it's making manufacturers are having a harder time just slipping through and offering us less volume for the same price because they've been doing some good work playing around with packages, selling us the illusion that nothing has changed. But a lot of Canadians out there are smart, and they're basically taking pictures with their phone. They're comparing products. And of course, when that happens, manufacturers tend to look really bad. So I do expect more companies to be more forthcoming in the future, telling people that they've actually shrunk the package.
The power of citizen journalism. All right, Doctor, a
Yeah.
quick 30 seconds left here, but any advice for our viewers in terms of coping with these rising prices?
I think a lot of people are noticing that prices are higher, and they know we're in this for a while. So 3 Canadians out of 4 have actually changed their methods in terms of grocery shopping, which is a good sign. The problem, of course, the dark side of food inflation is that some people are skipping meals now. 8% of Canadians are skipping meals now due to higher prices. 24% of Canadians are actually buying less food compared to last year. So you can feel that a lot of people are really struggling out there, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, indeed. All right, Dr. Charlebois, we are out of time, but thank you again for joining us today. On the opening day of the UN General Assembly's top-level meeting in New York, the Secretary General had some tough words for world leaders. The head of the United Nations says countries aren't ready or willing to tackle the major challenges that threaten the future of humanity and the fate of the planet. But the UN chief says there is still hope if nations work as one through cooperation and dialogue. This comes as world leaders hear from international advocates and politicians on the most pressing issues facing the world currently. Well, joining us now to tell us more about Canada's position at the 77th UN General Assembly is the Honourable Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Rae, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So a lot of things are expected to be discussed at today's meeting. What are you hoping to come out of this meeting following a year full of international crises, war, and more?
Well, I think I have to give your viewers and listeners a sense of the dynamics of this week. You have 150 leaders of countries. You have 193 countries that are represented. You have many, many civil society organizations, NGOs from around the world, all coming together, all descending on New York at exactly the same time in a very intense 10-day period to have a discussion about a whole range of issues. It's an extraordinary range. There are almost 400 side events on issues around the environment, human rights, conflicts, climate change. You go down the list, it's all there. It's all part of the discussion. I think what the Secretary General was saying today was, look, we are in a very serious moment. We're in a very difficult time with the possibility of a global recession on top of all the other crises that we have been dealing with. And we simply have to make progress. And I think he's right. We do have to make progress. We have to find a way to get enough common ground that will allow us to stop the really serious downward slide in global security, on climate change, inequality issues, the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. All these things go together, and it's really, really important for us to recognize that we have to make progress.
A lot of important conversations to keep our eyes on, Ambassador. Now, Russia's war with Ukraine is going to be a big part of discussions at the gathering. So what is Canada's stance at the General Assembly when it comes to this conflict in particular?
Well, we've been very clear from the outset that this is an unprovoked illegal attack being carried out by the Russians against Ukraine, that it is a war of aggression. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt. And that in carrying out that war, the Russians have been guilty of terrible, terrible atrocities. The knock-on effects, if you like, of this aggression have been really serious, not just for the people of eastern Ukraine, where most of the fighting has been taking place, but for all of Ukraine and then all of Eastern Europe. And then when it comes to food and export of food and the cost of living and the effect on energy security, for example, all of these critical questions, it's had a terrible cascading effect. And that's the one that we're dealing with now. And that's why I think thoughtful people are really very, very concerned about the likelihood of a global recession and what that recession will mean for debt levels, whether people go bankrupt or not, whether countries go bankrupt or not. And we have to understand that these are all possibilities now as a result of what the Russians have been doing.
Some very concerning possibilities, Ambassador Ray. Now, another important topic will be climate change. And Mr. Guterres said something interesting today. He's calling on developing nations to pay for loss and damage happening in poor nations who contribute little to climate change. Now, the question here is that a fair request for Canada in particular?
Well, I think all of the advanced economies are going to have to ask themselves the question. Once the science tells us that the unlimited pollution of the atmosphere with carbon emissions has a serious impact on the weather and on the climate, can we honestly say that we had nothing to do with the losses and the damages which many countries have been experiencing as a result of what's taken place? So I don't think we can rule out the logic of what's being proposed. I think we can all argue about the numbers, about the affordability of it and how it's going to be done. But I've been very pleased that in my government, the government of Canada has not taken a position that says, never, 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 we will never discuss this. What we've tried to say is, okay, let's start to get real about what this means, because it's not a one-time payment. It's not like an insurance company paying out for one time. It's about dealing with the impact that these storms, these rising sea levels, the incredible impacts that are being experienced by a great many countries.
Recent comments by the U.S. president are sparking debate around whether there is an end in sight for the pandemic. In a Sunday episode of CBS's 60 Minutes, Joe Biden acknowledged that there is a problem when it comes to COVID-19, but he believes the pandemic is over. However, the U.S. continues to see about 400 deaths per day due to the virus. Following the message, White House officials quickly clarified that the comments did not mean a change in policy. But Mr. Biden is not alone in his optimism, with the director of the WHO recently suggesting that the end of the pandemic is in sight. Well, this comes as restrictions continue to be lifted in Canada, and life seems to be returning to a pre-pandemic normal. But with flu season ahead of us, just how comfortable should we be amid the ongoing pandemic? Joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with this, Dr. Raut. What is the current state of the pandemic in Canada?
Well, in the last 24 hours, we've had about 4,000 cases across the country. Now, keep in mind, in the beginning of August, we were seeing about 20,000 cases a day, and in April, close to 60,000 cases a day. So quite an improvement there. We continue to have COVID deaths. About 21 people died from COVID-19 in Canada in the last 24 hours. And in total, Canada has suffered around 45,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic. From a prevention perspective, 31 million of us, or about 83% of Canadians, are fully vaccinated, which is much higher than the worldwide number of about 63%.
Now, if we go to Mr. Biden's interview for CBS's 60 Minutes, he was pointing to fewer people wearing masks. And right now, we can see social distancing being less of a concern in society. So is this indicative of the end of the pandemic, Dr. Raut, or are we heading toward another wave?
Well, I think both of your points of view there are actually right. The WHO also agrees that we're coming close to the end of the pandemic, and we're starting to see a lot of COVID-19 measures being gradually dropped. But I don't think that means the end of some waves. I think we're going to see a lot of them come and go, and it's quite natural to see these ebbs and flows with virus infections. I think we're definitely going to see another spike around Christmas and the holidays, but the important thing there is to make sure we're still vigilant when things worsen.
And meanwhile, we know flu season is coming up. So how will influenza impact the pandemic this fall and winter, Doctor?
That's a great question. Now, remember, pre-COVID, influenza was the cause of death for about 7,000 Canadians a year. So that's still a number we'd like to decrease considerably. But here's what I've seen so far. Many people in Toronto are still wearing masks. Many are still social distancing and trying to avoid these larger crowds. So the net effect of this is we're going to see, hopefully, a lower transmission of colds and influenza during the fall and winter. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this change is going to really make a difference in terms of reducing the number of influenza cases and COVID-19.
All right, Dr. Well, a lot of experts say the COVID-19 virus will stay with us for some years to come. So what does the end of the pandemic look like?
That's an interesting question because the WHO has a very formal way of determining the end of a pandemic. It's done it about 6 times since 2007 for influenza, polio, twice for Ebola, as well as Zika and monkeypox. But really, it's an 18-member committee of experts who look at the data points like mortality rates, vaccine rates, and determine whether the pandemic has ended. So interestingly, there isn't a hard data point, but more of a scientific consensus.
All right, Dr. Rao. Now, we're also learning about the impacts of long COVID. So can you tell us a little bit more about what we know so far about it and how you see this condition being treated in the coming years? Will this be a crisis within itself?
Right. I think this is going to be a huge challenge for us to face. So what we know is with long COVID, we have fatigue, memory deficits, shortness of breath, sleep problems, and joint pains. Those are the 5 most commonly observed symptoms there. So I really hope that health ministries, both federally and provincially, will have a very targeted approach to at least these 5 issues. We're going to really need to see teams and funding for long COVID clinics where a group of healthcare workers can really effectively provide relief for patients who are suffering these symptoms.
All right, Dr. Rout, about a minute left here, but what can Canadians do to stay safe while enjoying the upcoming fall and winter seasons and the festivities that come with them?
Well, Nima, in the coming months, we're going to see a lot of diversity of reasons to gather, including Rosh Hashanah, Diwali, Halloween, Christmas, and many others. So these are really times for Canadians to deeply connect with families and friends. The pandemic is slowly coming to an end, but it's not there yet. So with that in mind, I still recommend some caution. A quick rapid test before a big event or a family gathering is still a great way to keep our loved ones safe.
Always a helpful interview. Dr. Rao, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Thanks again for joining us on the Forum Daily Weekend Review, and we'll see you again next time.